Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're talking to some of the host of Red Star over Asia, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And we're going to start with Mike here.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I couldn't hear you guys for a second. Had a little technical problem.
All right. So, Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't hear you. I cut out there for a second. Yeah, my name is Mike. I'm from the U.S., but I live in Busan, South Korea. And with Bori and a couple other comrades, we have a podcast based in South Korea called Red Star Over Asia. We cover Asian politics, history, and social movements from a socialist perspective.
All right. And Bori, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, hey guys, I'm Mori. I'm currently in Seoul, South Korea. I'm co-hosting Red Star Over Asia with Mike, and I guess more personal details will be revealed throughout our conversation. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having us.
All right. Glad that you're here. And I have a history with South Korea. I lived in Yongin-si, outside of Seoul for about 2 years, and then I lived in Daejeon, then in Jeonju, way in the quote rural part of South Korea. Although I always like to point out that it's still bigger than, like, I don't know, the one city that was considered rural was bigger than, I think, about 10 different U.S. states in population. So didn't seem that rural to me. So I'm going to ask you guys a kind of leading question, because you do a podcast about, the Asian left, the particularly the left, and so far in South Korea, events in Asia, such as the recent, well, I guess it's almost a year old now, the coup in Myanmar, et cetera, and so forth. But why should leftists in the U.S. follow what's going on in Asia outside of the People's Republic of China?
You want to give a shot at this, Mike?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. Obviously, China is if you go by the media or whatever, obviously is geopolitically the most important kind of player in Asia. And obviously, in terms of the rhetoric within U.S. electoral politics, China and Russia, the big boogeyman or whatever. But people forget, and I think a lot of people aren't even aware, there are roughly 28,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. Mm-hmm. South Korea is a core part of the U.S.'s military alliance in this region of the world. The U.S. and South Korea's military actually have a joint command structure. And South Korea is an important key, maybe one of the key parts of the U.S.'s so-called pivot to Asia, which you discussed a little bit earlier. So for people who are concerned about international solidarity and building ties with workers in strategic places in the world where people can amplify their collective power, South Korea is very, very important. South Korea is an important part of the global economy in a lot of various ways. So making connections between leftist socialists in the U.S. and in South Korea is not only good in terms of just sort of the ethos of international solidarity, but can also be very strategic as well. And what happens in South Korea does have a big impact on how U.S. foreign policy plays out, has a big impact on domestic U.S. policy. North Korea is obviously a factor in all this in terms of, recent history, which people are probably most familiar with, seeing in the news, the bromance with Trump and Kim Jong-un, the kind of bizarre back and forth that went on there with the peace initiatives. So I don't know. Those are a few thoughts on why I think people should care about it. What would you say, Bori?
I guess we have that. one point I could add is that not only does the U.S. and South Korea have a joint military force, it's also under the command of the Asia Pacific Command of the U.S. military. So when peace activists, anti-war activists, nationalist groups, and also what do you call them? Green groups, activists protested the THAAD missiles being placed into Seongju of the Gyeongbuk province, which is still happening, and which is still happening. These THAAD missiles aren't under the U.S. Korea Joint Command, but it's directly under the U.S. Pacific Command. So it's part of the global missile defense system that the U.S. is implementing, and you can see, although on the surface level it's justified as defending South Korea, or at least South Korea bought it through, accepted it by the argument that it's a defense against North Korea's nukes. But as anyone with common sensical knowledge knows, that it doesn't provide a defense against North Korea nukes. South Korea is way too close. It's a missile defense against China, and you can see that placed in Japan and Guam. And so this whole pivot to China strategy, part of the US's grand strategy of projecting its hegemony, especially in Asia. South Korea is a big partner in it. So I guess in that sense, trying to disrupt imperialist workings requires, I guess, international solidarity, or a very more concrete way of connecting and coordinating actions with locals, I guess. So that's, I guess, one reason why the US left should look into Asia politics, because Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, these are all American sub-partners in its new Cold War against China. I guess another more basic point would be from the standpoint of labor solidarity. So Taiwan and South Korea is well known for its semiconductor industries. And from what I've grasped, these come after from Silicon Valley manufacturing, after rising labor costs and industrial safety regulations were put too much of a were rising too highly. So in South Korea, you can see a constantly going protest against Samsung Semiconductor manufacturing industry, because it's a very big cause for leukemia, and Samsung doesn't acknowledge that. So there's been a decade-old fight over getting Samsung to recognize that semiconductor manufacturing was the basic cause behind all that. But this is coming from, I guess, the US. But so that's just an example of manufacturing crossing borders to find a more cheaper labor market, which is still constantly happening. So in South Korea now, that's as South Korea's capital has grown sufficiently, it's investing and moving its manufacturing factories into China, Vietnam, India, etc. So when we have solidarity across borders, this is something that can be somewhat prevented. So I guess so those two big reasons, it just comes off the top of my head.
Well, I would, to add on to that, I think about, if you look at the history of quote globalization unquote, you had Korea in the 70s was South Korea in the 70s was a pretty underdeveloped nation. It was used for textile manufacturing. As Korea started to solidify its economic base in the late 70s, the US started putting more and more import restrictions on it, and Korea did then what the US was doing. Actually, it exported a lot of its factories to Bangladesh. and began like sort of a kind of triple textile industry to get around U.S. tariffs. So when you don't think about labor as part of a global chain, some of the unions at the time were endorsing the tariffs to keep Korean textiles out of the United States, and it actually led to an even cheaper textile industry, right? So like that is the historical example from the 70s, and you see this recapitulated now in high tech manufacturing from South Korea to other parts of Asia now. We also see this with Japan. I mean, Japan's done the same thing many times, right? So that's a big deal. I think it's important. Maybe as the next question is, the South Korea and a lot of the East Asian left has to play a kind of delicate balancing game between powers, right? I mean, because the U.S. wants to use them to maintain or expand its hegemony as it's currently in threat. That doesn't always mean that the PRC's interest is necessarily in the interest of the left in any of these particular countries either. Would you like to talk about that a little bit? How does that complicate organizing, for example, in South Korea? It's already pretty hard.
Well, I think Bori probably has a more substantive answer to that, but I think just some context for people who may not know, this is important to just be aware of when you think about the left in South Korea and how organizing plays out. There is a very severe set of legislation, the National Security Act, which makes it illegal to be part of any sort of pro-communist organization, which, as you can, and it's targeted obviously at North Korea, potential collaborators with North Korea. But as you can imagine, the way that it has been used historically, it's used, to crack down on trade union organizing, to crack down on, pretty mild social, things that are clearly not collaboration with a foreign power. So that's one thing to keep in mind in terms of how the South Korean left relates to China and Marxism generally, and how just left organizing unfolds in South Korea generally. So for people who weren't aware of that, it's sort of a thing that's haunting over your head at all times in South Korea.
Yeah, so I guess I was taken back for a bit there because it's so ingrained that I didn't know where to start. But I guess that's the answer to it. Anti-communism and a sub-partner of the U.S. South Korea was at its inception that. So national security law was implemented during the Korean War to crack down on leftists under the semi-dictatorship of the right-wing Lee Seung-man, who got his PhD in math from Princeton and was an American favorite. There was a big so under Japanese imperial colonial rule. It was the leftists, socialists, communists, and other labor sympathetic liberals and nationalists who were really doing the grunt work of resisting imperial rule. And there were lots of mass organizations organized under that as well. But and because Japan is so close and they needed a large cheap labor force, a lot of Koreans had to be moved to Japan as well. So we're talking about, I think, so I'm always confused with the numbers. We don't go with the commas here. We talk in digits of 4, but anyhow, I think it's 3 million. 3 million Koreans were in Japan at the end of liberation, of the colonial rule. After liberation, there were 3 million Koreans in Japan, and they were all preparing to move to Korea because they finally have this place they can call their mother country back, a nation country, a nation state, and the U.S. After letting the Japanese ruling class off the hook because they wanted to, they've really immediately started thinking about the post-war kind of framing of carving up of East Asia, and the Soviet Union was just advancing down. That's why they brought down the nukes in the two-time nukes in Japan as well. The U.S. wasn't happy about the leftist presence in Japan and Korea, so all those mass organizations were crushed, basically. All the massacres that happened before and during the Korean War, these were just massive massacres of civilians, of anyone just even hinted at sympathizing with the left, that were so this great massacre called the Podo. Darn, I don't know the English term, but anyhow, it's some Podo, uh, something. So there's this organization for ex-leftists that the South Korean state wanted to have a check on, so that they wouldn't start collaborating with North.
It's like AA for leftists or something.
Yeah, and then they had quotas to fill up. So everyone who didn't even have a leftist background were kind of brought in and signed in. And when the North started advancing down south, and the South Korean government just rounded up every single Podo member and just killed them off. So we're talking about people in the several millions here. And then that's the inception. That national security law is still in place. This was used to clamp down and massacre civilians and leftists of all stripes. The South Korea was in a military dictatorship until 1987. Even after liberalization, immediately a military strongman was elected again. And even after liberals were elected into office, those harsh military-like suppression through the police and just these people with batons and tear gas canisters, like we're one of the proud exporters of the water pumps used in Thailand, used to suppress democracy protesters there. And I from my understanding, tear canisters, tear gas, these are exported to Israel and Turkey as well, because we used it on our own population, and now the more stronger portions of it get exported because of laws. But anyhow, so that's all baked in. It's so if you have any sympathy for the North, that's grounds for you to be arrested. And for communists, that's made it a kind of that's precisely the delicate balance that you have to go through. You don't want to be sympathetic to the North, but as anti-imperialists, you don't just go follow liberal propaganda and just like shit on the North either. But there is a real suppression happening there. For communists, it's more about whether the police can prove that you're planning to overturn the state, and that's the grounds for your arrest. And these arrests are, although the major ones are currently the National Intelligence Service, although they make up spy occasions. So these poor folks from, I guess, defectors from North Korea or passing through China, they're framed as spies when they're not really not. This is how much the NIS is really kind of anxious about losing power. So even through that declining power, the national security law is still in place and used to suppress leftists.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting holdover. It goes all the way back to the 40s, as you say. And despite, quote, democratization in the late 80s, it never went away. One thing that we talked about off air that I know from living there, because we were even as foreigners, when I was doing Marxist just discussion groups in South Korea, I hid my name. I didn't really think we were going to actually be in any danger, but we did hear about them occasionally just deporting labor activists, whatever, under the national security law. They could do that. The interesting thing, though, about the national security law is that it's really draconian, but it's not enforced all the time. It's enforced selectively, so you never really know when they're going to use it. And I was talking to you guys off air about how I went to a Marxism conference, I believe in 2012, 2013, in the end of the Imam Bach administration, and before Park, just before Park came in, and we were a little worried because they started using the national security law actively again, and technically we could have been considered in violation of it, but of course nothing happened. It was fine. But that element of fear, and I think people don't understand how late some of the massacres happened. I mean, the Gwangju, which I'm probably mispronouncing. My Pinyin pronunciation is quite bad. I apologize for that. The Gwangju uprising and massacre, that's as late as 1980. You know, and that's a huge massacre. I believe you guys did a show on it, correct? Or two. But another infamous one that was even more brutal is the Jeju uprising and massacre. And
yeah, they killed about 10 to 20% of the island's population. I mean, it was genocidal essentially. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, they were protesting. I mean, a lot of it was driven by people in Jeju were upset about the planned division of the Korean Peninsula, which was done without really consultation with the Korean people themselves. And then, yeah, it was just a total scorched earth response to the uprising, which, by the way, Jeju is an island off the coast of South Korea. It's a province for people who may not know.
Yeah, it's just one has its a unique culture too, basically, or semi-unique culture.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. One thing too, just quickly on the National Security Act, because I think this really illustrates in a really shocking way. A few years ago, there was a party called the Unified Progressive Party, which you may have been here when this happened, I think, Varn. Anyway, the two kind of primary factions of the South Korean left had gotten together to form an electoral vehicle, which historically there can sometimes be some sectarianism and kind of differences between those two factions. So they started winning some seats in the National Assembly. And then it's a long story, but essentially security services kind of set them up as being potentially involved in a plot with North Korea. So they used the National Security Act. The top courts dissolved the party, and some of the leaders are still in prison now. So
yeah, wasn't Lee Jung-hee imprisoned in like 2014?
No, it's Lee
Sung-hee. Okay.
Lee Jung-hee is what was one of the presidential candidates for the 2012 presidential election. So she's still good. Lee is the one is still in jail currently. Yeah,
he was accused of a pro-North rebellion or something kind of.
Yeah,
the
accusation goes along the lines that he had this RO, Revolutionary Organization, and they were talking about in the events of a revolution, they would take control of certain, I guess, electricity facilities and stuff like that. So these were offhand remarks. These were kind of like joking. Although I guess it might be inappropriate to be joking even in a. So it was part of a lecture, if an insider's sort of lecture, a talk, and he was just kind of joking about that. But it seemed like all those comments were used against him and to prove him that he was trying to overhaul the state, overturn the state.
Yeah, so that arrest happened about a year after I left, but I was there during the Unified Progressive Party's presidential campaign in 2012. So I think that we also should contextualize that was also during a time period because of the transition of power from Kim Jong-un to Kim Jong-un, where tensions between the U.S. and the DPRK, the North Korea, were kind of at a high for the first time since the early 80s, right? Like it was, there was the Yongpyeong Island, incident. There was the ship incident. There was the fact that the U.S. and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, refused to back down on all their war games over and over and over again. And so tensions were really, really high. And I think the conservative administrations of the time, both, I mean, I don't want to get too into the weeds of Korean politics, but like the Lee Myung-bak faction of conservatives was trying to crack down, but also I think to look strong against the Park faction that was coming into power. And there's also religious stuff tied into that's hard to explain to outsiders, so I'm not going to get into it. I mean, there's Buddhist Christian tensions involved and all kinds of stuff that's very contextual to South Korea. But I do remember a lot of that happening, but I wasn't there for the dissolution when the Constitutional Court, like 8-1, dissolve the Unified Progressives, like
something
outright.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact numbers, but yeah.
Has stuff gotten easier for leftists in South Korea since the end of the Park administration?
So the current administration under Moon Jae-in is a liberal, and the liberals before him, like Roh Moo-hyun, who Moon Jae-in was serving when he was president, was also a human rights lawyer, and human rights lawyers in South Korea is also kind of like an activist. But so there were great expectations that Roh Moo-hyun, or even before him, Kim Dae-jung, would repeal the national security law, because technically there are already laws that clamp down on attempts to overturn the state in the criminal laws. So there's a what do you call it? It's reductionist. But anyhow, Kim Dae-jung didn't, Roh Moo-hyun didn't, Moon Jae-in didn't. So the national security law is still in place and still going on. Well, it's used to arrest, not exactly deport locals. It's used to deport migrant worker activists. So there's a migrant workers union in South Korea with the explicit support of the KCTU, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which is the biggest confederation of unions in South Korea currently, with, I think the number is 10 million. No, that's too big. One. Anyhow, so every single leader of the migrant workers union has been deported. They've been stalked and hunted down by the NIS, and that's the state. I don't think it's been easy under the Moon administration. I think one thing to note is that for every single president, the KCTU has put on the demands of down with the president at some point. That hasn't happened under the Moon administration. So I would say that it's become even harder for leftists to organize under the Moon administration, because all the kind of critical liberals that were against the administration under Lee or Park all pivoted and catered to the Moon administration. They've been completely sucked in, which makes opposition to the government that much more difficult. In terms of repression, things aren't really that different. So currently, it's because of the COVID-19 situation, the government has initiated lots of different methods for quarantine. And one thing that they are refusing to back down on is the ban on rallies. So you would have like religious gatherings. That's okay for 20 people. An outside rally, you can't have any more than 10. And you will have more than 10 police officers gathered up and trying to prevent people from rallying up. So there are clear double standards coming in. Currently, the liberal and the conservative press are attacking the KCTU for trying to hold a general strike. Currently, 3 members of the Public Workers Union have been confirmed to be infected by COVID-19, and they had participated in the July 3rd rally for kind of like a convention in preparation for the general strike. And the conservative press is making it so that, like, look at these commies, these Reds, that like it's red baiting, and they're saying that these are the reason why the infections numbers aren't coming down, despite like all the precautions that the KCTU is having, despite the fact that this confirmation came like 14, 15 days after, where usually symptoms come up 10 days after, which makes there's time discrepancy. Points out it's very unlikely that that rally was where the infection happened. So it's kind of like under an Obama situation where leftists, or currently under Biden, where leftists critical of the administration are trying to find in like pathways to influence the government, which makes the state kind of absorb all opposition, which makes it even more hard.
Speaking of that, particularly given how has relations with the North gone under the 2 non-conservative or liberal administrations? I'm going to use non-conservative in quotation marks. I know in 2017 there was a return to the Sunshine Policy. Would you care to explain the history of the Sunshine Policy to my audience and why it may or may not be that big of a deal?
Mike, do you want to talk about the Sunshine Policy, and then I can go after you?
So Sunshine Policy is basically, I think it's an Aesop parable where the sun and the wind had a wager over whether they could get that man take off their coat. So what was argued under the Kim administration, Kim Dae-jung, was that so far we were taking up the wind's position of trying to force the North to abandon its nuclear program. Now we will put sunshine onto the North by giving it support and etc., and trying to hold peace talks, etc., so that they would be nudged into abandoning the nuke program. Now the conservatives, the right-wingers, attacked this policy as like all these rice that was sent up, the North would sell it and use that as materials to further enhance their nuclear program. And that's a criticism that it went under the 2 right-wing administrations. They went with the hawk position, the wind position, to further antagonize the North and try to force them into submission, which didn't work out, obviously. And under the Moon administration, there has been certain gestures towards peace talks, but I would say that that's all bluff. It's all bullshit, and there hasn't really been a significant kind of approach to really solve or get the North into a workable position to hold the peace talks. For example, the annual military joint military exercises with the U.S. These are aggressions. These have like explicit operations that aim to that have like special forces operations aiming to get the head of Kim Jong-un. Like this is ridiculous. You can't hold these exercises and tell the North that we just want to have a conversation. But Mike, you do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think you're right. Under Moon Jae-in, I mean, there's been a lot of pomp and stuff and like, media circus around, like, and in some ways it is significant. I mean, for Koreans, I think when you see these presidents stepping into the other side of the peninsula and stuff. And there were like some restorations of family reunions. So, I mean, it hasn't been completely without concrete steps that have actually made a real difference. But compared to the Sunshine Policy that he was talking about in the 90s, Sunshine Policy actually did have a lot more like tangible on the ground projects, like inter-Korean projects. Whereas I think now like the current situation, there are far more international sanctions imposed by the Security Council, et cetera, that really do limit, even if Moon wanted to do this, the Moon administration, they do limit the possibility of things like the Kaesong industrial complex, which maybe some people have heard of. So it was part of a kind of an experiment to use South Korean capital and North Korean labor in these sort of like special economic zones in DPRK. But one thing that I think has always interested me about how reunification and reconciliation is always talked about in sort of liberal sectors is it's often framed that the benefits of reunification or increased economic cooperation are, well, we have the North has most of these like rare minerals that we can exploit. They just don't have the technology. We have all this cheap North Korean labor. So it's like sort of this kind of like, I don't want to say inter-imperialist, but it is this very like asymmetrical relationship. It's like the selling point for trying to sell reunification and more collaboration with North Korea is always on the terms of the South is going to be able to just like kind of exploit the northern half of the peninsula for its resources and cheap labor. And you see that in the way the Moon administration's rhetoric has gone around trying to like pitch his approach to North Korea to people who are skeptical.
Yeah, and I would add to that it's not only rhetoric, because the Moon administration had the Chaebols, the economic conglomerates, go along with him when he visited North Korea. So, and they were at the forefront. So this is like it's quite explicit how the economic powers, well, it goes up for a bit when the Hyundai president Jung Mong-jun took some cows with him to North Korea to visit North Korea, and these are all deemed in terms of a kind of economic internal colonialization of North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
So exploiting cheap labor, its rare earth minerals, and it's not really done in the sense of so peace comes second, and general prosperity for the two comes second. This is why the general populace is very kind of skeptical of reunification nowadays. No one young really believes that our dream is for reunification. Everyone expects that there will be. Its terms are quite chauvinist. It's like, look at Germany. Look at how East Germany took down West Germany alongside with it. We can all see how that's bullshit and all that. How East Germany has, like, it's a terrible loss. I would say that something akin to that, or even worse, will happen to North Korea, at least on the terms that it's being discussed in South Korean circles, which I wouldn't say is necessarily how it will turn out, because things aren't looking that great right now.
I would another wrinkle in the reunification that's never talked about is the Korean Autonomous Zone in China and the Chinese Koreans. Could you explain that situation to my listeners? Because I find that Americans do not know about this, like, at all. Not even a bit.
Sure. So there are, I guess we could kind of term it like Korean diaspora. So there are Koreans in the Korean Peninsula, obviously. There are still Koreans in Japan who are really like second-rate citizens. They are discriminated on a legal basis. The Japanese government has exploited loopholes to not guarantee them any citizen rights. The Jainichi. There are Koreans in the Manju region of China, and there are Koreans elsewhere. So like who immigrated. So there are Koreans in the U.S. obviously. There are some Koreans that went to Cuba. There are Koreans in Latin America, etc., etc. The biggest portions, I would say, I think, is U.S., China. But in China, okay, so one more point would be that, so when Koreans Korean diaspora return to Korea, who they can get recognized as their Korean nationality through their parents' bloodlines or something like that. There's a clear discrimination happening. So it's really much more easier for you to gain Korean nationality coming from the U.S. than say from China, where the Koreans in China are used as a cheap labor force. So Korea has a great eat out culture, and it's because all the restaurants are very cheap. But the reason they're cheap is because the labor is undervalued because it's usually older women doing it, and of those older women, a significant portion are Chinese Koreans, who are they can speak the same language, might have a slightly different dialect, but they're much more easier to exploit because they're not granted full citizenship, and they're all here on work visas, and that legal discrepancy is the basis for keeping those labor costs down. So, yeah, I guess that's one thing I could cover.
Well, I was also thinking about how that affects the Yamban. I think that's the correct place. The Yambayan the Korean autonomous zone in China, which was technically contested territory in the end of the Choson dynasty between the Choson rulers and the Manchu rulers of then China, that has been kind of incorporated into the modern PRC, and it's kind of a recognized self-rule term, and like Chinese Korean is the official language of the province. That seems to complicate how do I say it? Like, one of the interesting things about anti-imperialism and specific to South Korea is that the U.S. presence makes ever handling the situation in the North very precarious for China, because one, they don't want a lot of North Korean refugees going in the Korean autonomous zone for fear of stoking nationalist pressures there, and two, because they don't want the U.S. with bombs right on the border of China. Obviously, it's like duh. So it does seem to be a massive complication factor. I mean, also in a way that also affects like Korean workers' relationship to Chinese workers, et cetera, and so forth. So I think that's just something that when I try to explain why it's such a complicated situation and why kind of a lot of different sides benefit from the status quo in the Korean Peninsula, that's part of why. And another clear reason why is, you're right. Despite all the talk of Minhyuk, which I guess we'd have to explain to, it basically means Korean race. That there's a lot of hostility both to North Koreans and to Korean Chinese, and they are used as kind of an internal subjugated labor force. And then after that, South Asians and I guess Chinese immigrants are used as a subjugated labor force in South Korea. Is that, you feel like that is fair to say?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I guess one thing, so Varn touched on a very important point. China is not like the master behind North Korea. China is more of viewing North Korea as a strategic liability. Mm-hmm. But that might change. So one of the things that was significant for the recent U.S. South Korea summit meeting was that, and also the one that the U.S. held with Japan, was that they both recognize the need for peace in the Northeast Asian region, which includes the South China Sea and Taiwan. Now, this hasn't been explicitly stated before. Now, if China views this, China went kind of was got really mad about it, obviously for their own reasons. And for that, they might leverage North Korea no longer as a liability, but as a more kind of using it as reasons to antagonize or prepare for the antagonization from the US. Because South Korea and Japan are, at least on the summit meeting level, they're clearly siding with the US on this issue.
I guess another interesting question that comes to my mind is the relationship between China, South Korea, and Vietnam. Vietnam is obviously a nominally communist country. It has liberalized. It's similar, actually, to the PRC in many ways, but it's much, much smaller. And it does have territorial disputes with the PRC, and frankly, has a historical complication with the Han Chinese in specific, being that they were part, they'd been incorporated into various pre-communist Chinese empires. It does seem like this puts a lot of the Asian left kind of in a weird spot, because obviously Vietnam is sort of a natural ally. China is sort of a natural ally in some ways. But how do you pivot there? Because the tensions between Vietnam and China have led to the U.S. being able to improve their relations with the Vietnamese government, in quotation marks. For my audience to know that I understand that that's all cynical. How has Vietnamese South Korean relations improved or gotten worse? And I need to add another caveat. Historically speaking, there's a lot of bad blood between the Vietnamese and the South Koreans, because the Americans used South Korean troops to do things they didn't want to use the American troops to do. So they would send in South Korean special forces to do things that they wouldn't ask to do things that were so dehumanizing. They wouldn't ask American special forces to do it. I actually did not know about this until I was in South Korea and had someone inform me about that historical tension and how it was used. And so are there still high tensions with Vietnam? Has that gotten better? And, what if we wanted a solidaristic work of solidarity, how could we work in that situation? What could people do to at least understand it?
Yeah, so I guess one thing to note first is that I already mentioned this before, but the U.S. had a huge part in suppressing the Korean left in South Korea and Japan after liberation. And that continued on. The Korean left was basically wiped out. It was not a force of its own until the 80s, where Marxism had its revival, and students and intellectuals who were mostly liberals, who wanted some sort of liberal democracy, radicalized and understood that to get that kind of bourgeois democracy, they would also need participation from workers, etc., etc. So students went into the factories to organize workers, create labor unions, and that led to the creation of the KCTU, and that's the sort of legacy we have. But the point I wanted to make is that because of that break of the left being wiped out, the prior tradition of internationalism that Korean communists of the early 20th century had went away as well. So currently, South Korea is technically an island. It doesn't have any land connection through to mainland Asia, through North Korea. So, and the other three borders are all the oceans. But also, it's isolated in the sense that it hasn't really pursued internationalist endeavors, at least on organizational levels. There might be one organization that would have links to an another organization in another country. But as social movements, these links are very weak. So the internationalism of the early 20th century, I would say that like Koreans would have had active roles in the creation of the Japanese Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, of course the Korean Communist Party of its own. They would, and like because Korea did not exist, did not have its own state, leftists were forced into either the Chinese Communist Party or the Japanese Communist Party. One interesting point would be that after liberation, the Chinese characters used for it were shared upon between Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, because every leftist in those three countries were all under the Japanese Communist Party. But this legacy was disrupted; it was broken off. So there is not really a significant kind of internationalist effort existing at the moment. This is the kind of lacunae or impasse that I guess our project Red Star Over Asia kind of wants to address, however modest it might be. Well, that's the point I want to make first. And the second would be, although from my knowledge, I think the Public Healthcare Union in South Korea, is specifically the Seoul National University Hospitals one, has connections with the Vietnam Public Healthcare Union, or like there has been some back and forth there, but like on the labor of trade unions or on it's very weak. There are only one international coordinator in the KCTU. There's one in the Public Workers Union, but it's still very weak. Otherwise, yes, there is bad blood, but we also have to acknowledge, keep in mind that Vietnam won that war, the one that the South Korea troops had actively played a part in, and which the troops that had dehumanized the Vietnamese returned to Korea and committed the Gwangju massacre. These are the same people. They were all the generals that Chun Doo-hwan, the next military dictator that initiated that massacre. All the generals were kind of tightly knit together from their experiences of the Vietnam War. So there's this shared history in that negative sense. But currently, after liberalization, Vietnam is more of a trading partner. A lot of small capital has started to invest there. From my understanding, it's, I think, the second or third largest foreign capital investing currently in Vietnam. So if you go, so I've met a lot of people who have connections, who have businesses in Korea. I don't like personally know them, just like, but otherwise, I don't know. It's so the internationalism doesn't exist as a legacy. Although there's bad blood, Vietnam won that war. So other than the victims or the people who were directly affected by it, the nationalist mood, from my understanding, is more of like, we won that war. Why is South Korea sorry to us? Like, it's clearly different from a leftist or a feminist perspective, obviously, but the nationalist mood in Vietnam, from my understanding, is like that. And then currently, it's more of a business endeavor. So that would be 3 points I would make in relation to Vietnam.
And those are great points. I guess the specter looming when we talk about the Asian left and how it can pivot, and the kind of dual role that historically, that nationalism has played in all of the post-imperial world, or the imperialized world, however you want to think about it. It seems like Korea and Japan in particular have had, because of their history of the U.S. liquidating their lefts, of their own right wing liquidating their lefts too, because of, in Japan, Japanese imperialism played a very strange role internationally, actually, historically, as pivot, as at first offering itself up as against the Anglo, the British American world dominance as a kind of counter hegemonic anti-imperialist force, but then became an imperialist force itself. it's actually very interesting to go back and read debates like by W.E.B. Du Bois talking about like how Japan was going to be progressive against the United States. Kind of a historical irony now, but it does seem like nationalism becomes both something that is necessary to fight certain kinds of imperialism, but also something that gets a lot of the lefts in East Asia and South Asia kind of in a bind, because the nationalism cuts both ways. It cuts against the imperial powers, but also inhibits international solidarity between other Asian powers a lot of the time. I mean, I think about all the wrangling over islands off the coast between Japan and Korea, between Korea and China, between China and Japan. I mean, like, and it does seem to shut down solidarity sometimes. How do you see what do you think the proper response is for the Korean left towards nationalism?
Well, that's an ambitious question. I would say that I don't have like a position staked out. Like this is the pathway for the Korean left, but I've already embedded in a tradition that is has a particular relation to nationalism. Mike always loves to mention that the Korean left is widely divided into two factions. Nominally, the National Liberationist groupings and the People's Democracy groupings. And together, this is the theory of national liberation, people's democracy, revolution. So this is the theory of revolution in the South Korean left post 1980. Where the NLs and the PDs split is on the question of like, is there a possibility for critical support for nationalist liberal figures? For example, should the left have supported Kim Dae-jung or Baek Ki-won in the I think it was the 1992 presidential election, where the NLs, a large portion of them went in support of Kim Dae-jung because the principal contradiction, according to them, was the contradiction of nationalism, of that the Korean Peninsula being divided, and the large reason of that is American imperialism. So onto this point, I would think that Western leftists that's spot on. That seems to make sense. Why would anyone be critical of that? Well, then because South Korea is not simply an American colony, and it has its own capital playing a role, and therefore you can't just kind of glide over class differences and go on to support liberals in a broad front against American imperialism, because it's not effective in that way either. I think the current state of South Korea, although a lot of people would mention a kind of post-colonial kind of context or a sort of still a sub-partner, that's the word I was using, sort of kind of colonized people because there are U.S. troops in South Korea. I don't think colonialism or a kind of colonial relationship is useful in explaining South Korea currently. So an interesting observation made could be that there's this reversal of relations with regards to what the U.S. has with South Korea. So in World War I, the great powers were sucked in because of like skirmishes between the smaller sub-partners, right? Mm-hmm. But what Japan, South Korea, Taiwan are more concerned about is whether they will be sucked in when the U.S. has skirmishes with China. So the smaller partners are the ones that are being concerned about getting sucked into a bigger power's struggle for power. So this in other words means that South Korea has leverage over refusing to cooperate and coordinate with the U.S. and that gives us more leeway or more ways, like degrees of freedom, than is, at least on an impression level, supposed when you try to apply a kind of post-colonial lens to South Korea. I don't have a clear answer or a clear term or concept to designate what this is, and I think it's something that the Korean left needs to really think more strongly about. But because this internationalist kind of aspect, I feel is very missing in lots of discussions, and South Korea is very self-centered in its social movements. It's really largely missing. But all the frameworks used till now, I don't think they are working as well as they were supposed to be.
Anything to add, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, Bori's actually much more embedded in the South Korean left than I am, obviously, being a foreigner who lives in South Korea. But I mean, Varn, you're totally right that I thought about this a lot too, like how to break through that. I mean, just give a concrete example. I mean, this is an issue that flares up periodically, but there's the issue of the comfort women, which is sort of a euphemism for sex slaves during World War II. So Japan used a lot of South Korean women to be sex slaves for Japanese military. And how to atone for that legacy and compensate the victims and their families has been an ongoing source of tension between Japan and South Korea. And a big chunk of the left here, the kind of national liberation folks primarily were driving this, very rightly launched a big boycott campaign around Japan because there were some negotiations going on. Moon Jae-in, when he was elected, was demanding that Japan kind of re-enter talks to, try to kind of agree to some sort of like extended reparations, because the critique is that when this was originally settled officially, that the South Korean government at that time was sort of acting in bad faith and they didn't get a proper deal. So there was a huge widespread movement, boycott Japan, no Abe, which on the one hand, that's obviously like a good movement, a good issue to organize around. But on the other hand, too, it does sort of raise the question of how can we ever get to the point where we can build like some more solid ties between, I don't know, just as an example, the South Korean left and the Japanese left. I have much less of a clear answer than even Bori does.
Oh yeah,
I agree.
That's a great point to raise. So what happened was that I wouldn't say that the National Liberationists actually raised the issue itself. They kind of latched onto an already existing sentiment of, like, Korea is very nationalist, and liberals were rightly pissed off as well about Abe's comments and reactions to the issue of apologizing about its past history. And Japan initiated a trade war there. And Korea reacted in part by starting to refuse and boycott all Japanese products or anything related to Japan in any sense. And it got to really silly points where Korean operating and fully like Korean vegetables and those restaurants, but like serving Japanese food, were targets of boycotts as well. So like these restaurant owners had to put out like we are fully Korean, we have no relation to Japan and stuff like that. But the more important part is that because all the national liberationists who are embedded in the labor movement as well kind of latched onto this uncritically, when the Moon administration used that trade war as a means to alleviate labor restrictions. So currently, Korea has on the surface level, on the law, a restriction up to 52 hours of work a week. Korea has a very long working day, extremely high working day. It's on par, I think, with Mexico. It's like one of the highest of the OECD countries.
Having lived in both those countries, the Korean de facto one is even longer than the Mexico de facto one. The legal ones are like close, but like you work in Korea like all day, well into the night. Like And a lot of
and
it's
the
for free.
yeah. So yeah. So the Moon administration used that kind of boycott movement and that sentiment to gloss over and allows, like example for Samsung, to extend their working day even more.
Oh God.
So and the movement was not able to respond to that because they had uncritically latched onto this nationalist sentiment. Although on the other hand, the KCTU also was already like having these international solidarity events, crossovers with sections of the Japanese left and civil society movements and organizations that were critical of Abe, and they had visits from the Japanese organizers as well, where Koreans also went over to express solidarity. But these weren't enough, I guess. These weren't enough to kind of carve out a space where leftists can actually say that, no, well, Abe's shit, but Abe's shit within Japan as well. We need to have a more general sentiment that is sympathetic to, not like just antagonistic against Japanese as such or the Japanese government as such. We need to clearly identify and show solidarity with those against Abe as we are against ours. Like, but that was not possible in that particular conjuncture because I would say I would diagnose the lack of internationalism.
I would I want to ask one more question on Korea, then I'm going to pivot to just about your podcast. This has come up twice directly and a few times indirectly. The Chaebol system is the only other the only other country with something like it that I know of is Japan. But the international the national/international conglomerate system. Can you explain how massive these are in Korean life? Like, but particularly the Big Five, and because the Big Five, I think only two of them are not known outside of Korea. But I know it's a big question, but it's also tied into Korean nationalism, the whole Chaebol thing. So it's really,
I mean, so
And
embedded in
Japanese
everyday life,
colonialism.
I would say that, yeah, like you guys have everything ordered through Amazon.
Yeah.
All of our electronical devices are from Samsung or LG. You have monitors, you have laptops, you would have computers. Everything is from those two. The car industry is under Hyundai, basically, although there are a couple others that have been gobbled up. Kia was what you call it, was absorbed into Hyundai as well. So all the cars are Hyundai products. But I guess the real issue is less about how everything is the Chaebol's commodities and more about how much control they have over the political system in South Korea. So the conservatives love to talk about how North Korea is undemocratic. It's a kingdom of the Kim dynasty. In reality, South Korea is the dynasty of the Lee, true to its Joseon roots, I guess, of the Samsung dynasty. And Lee Jae-yong is probably going to be pardoned by Moon Jae-in for the Korean Thanksgiving presidential pardons this year, although he was arrested and put into jail because of his lobbying efforts of the previous president, who was pulled down through massive protests. And like Samsung also has control over 중앙일보, one of the three major newspaper outlets in Korea, and so that's Jungang is only under its direct control. Joseon and Tonga are also tightly knit in with, because like they're the bourgeois press par excellence. But also, I guess even under the Nomuhyun administration, it became a constant problem of how many of the higher end folks there, administrationers or representatives, had received and accepted Samsung scholarship money. So although you can't really pinpoint on like these are like they have direct orders from Samsung or something like that, it's hard to deny the influence they have over political matters as well. And Samsung has had a 70-year-old policy of not allowing any single labor unions underneath it. And that was only broken partially by the heroic efforts of the service center workers under Samsung Electronics. That was in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Samsung, because of the economic structure of South Korea, everything is subcontracted. And these subcontracts are used as loopholes to not be held responsible for labor practices of that subcontract companies, despite those mother companies having all control over like when workers are have to come to work, how much they have to produce, etc., etc. So you can see how that 70-year-old policy of no labor unions would affect South Korea at large. So this these service workers of Samsung Electronics succeeding in creating a labor union for themselves is not just a win for those workers, but for workers of is a general win for workers in South Korea because of the influence. I don't have the numbers right now, but it's entirely massive, and subcontracts go down to I think like 17 levels, and
Mm-hmm.
this is how labor prices are kept low. This is why the minimum wage level is kept very low, because all those rising costs would make that subcontracting would make subcontracting impossible because all those sub companies would go bankrupt, and that would make it so that the Chaebol companies would have to be held more responsible for their labor practices.
All right. Well, that's kind of a big deal. I was shocked when I lived in South Korea because until Amazon, it's not like the U.S. didn't have international conglomerates that ran everything, but they hid it. It was hidden. And when I was in Korea, I was like, oh, they don't hide how much of your life they control and how directly politically influential they are. It's just right out there. It's not hidden at all.
Yeah, baseball teams are named after them. I mean, I was in a coffee shop recently, and then someone I was with mentioned that Samsung actually owns the coffee shop chain. So it's like, even it is sort of hidden sometimes, but I mean, it is shocking how just like deep their tentacles are into like every aspect of.
Yeah, I remember my school paying rent to Lotte. I mean, like it was just strange. I was just like, okay, well, fine. I'm sure I probably pay rent to Amazon somehow, but anyway.
The distinctive feature of Chaebols is not that they like inhibit every single facet of our everyday lives. That's an obvious issue, but that's something conglomerates in other countries do as well. As I've mentioned, Amazon or in other Southeast Asian countries, there exist entities like Chaebols. What's particular about Chaebols is the ownership structure. So although they only hold a small share of a certain company, they make it so that that company holds shares of other companies. And so that this very minority share gains them control over the entire family of companies. So Samsung is not just Samsung, but it's Samsung Electronics. It has Samsung Insurance. It has Samsung, like all these different companies. They're all under direct control by the Lee family, because the Lee family has a small share of, I think, Everland, which has a share over. Everland is a amusement park in South Korea, one of the biggest, and that has a share in Samsung Electronics, and this is how, despite not having like legally the required amount for like holding executive positions, they effectively do so. And this is what is particular about South Korean Chaebol.
That's actually a good explanation. It even clears some stuff up for me. So thank you for that. I want to end on plugging your show. I know from this conversation you think the show is mostly about South Korea. It comes up, but it's not just about South Korea. You've done episodes on farmer struggles in India. You've done episodes on how leftists should probably start to conceptualize what's going on in Myanmar. You've done shows on just internationalism in general, and yellow peril in the United States. You seem to be off for the summer. Are you planning on releasing episodes again soon?
Yeah, we just recorded a 2-part episode with a good comrade of ours in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia.
The other Georgia.
Yeah, the other Georgia. So that's a 2-parter. We have to, it's actually my fault. I have to finish something before it can be released. So I will do that soon. But then, one of our co-hosts, he's kind of Korean American. He's in the US right now, but he's like coming back to Korea shortly. So when we're all in the same time zone, we're going to try to put things out more consistently. But yeah, some other future stuff coming up. We're going to have, we're maybe bumping this to the top of the queue, given the news and how Cuba's in the news. But we have a comrade in Havana. We were going to have him on to talk about how liberalization and the Chinese and Vietnamese models are influencing debates within the Cuban Communist Party.
It's pretty relevant right now, actually.
Yeah, so we're going to try to get him on ASAP. And we have a few other things lined up as well. So yeah, hope soon we're going to be able to put stuff out more consistently.
Awesome. That's
time zones are a bitch. So
so our perspective, I guess, would be that all of our co-hosts have a certain relationship to South Korea, whether they're Korean or based in Korea, and from that location, we try to access and learn about other leftist or social movements in other parts of Asia. So our basic audience is, I don't think a large portion of your audience, Varn, are the target audience for us, but we always appreciate another listen. But our target audience primarily would be leftists and other organizers in Asian countries. We're just hosting it in English because it's de facto universal language at the moment. That comes second. The first is because we only speak English. I guess if we could speak Chinese, maybe we could go with that, but sadly that's not true for the moment. And so
I think people don't realize how hegemonic English is as a second language in Asia. I mean,
it is absolutely it is. But hegemonic as a second language, but that doesn't mean that everyone freely speaks it fluently.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's also true.
So my English comes from not being brought up as or the private academic systems in South Korea, but more from having the lucky experience of being raised in the U.S. at the critical language acquisition stage. Everyone else, I'm more of an exception, but we're dire need for those exceptions in other countries as well. Just this podcast project, Mike kind of said that we should try and do is because we want to have this sort of platform where leftists in various contexts are able to engage with each other, learn and try to develop ties and networks so that we can, I guess, respond to events in a more direct and connected manner. So far, it's just getting off the ground. We started our podcast earlier this year, so I wouldn't say that we have like the biggest output of the podcasts out there, but we've had great guests, and we would appreciate people listening and giving feedback.
Yeah, I am including a link, and if you want to learn about stuff that you don't hear a lot in left media in the U.S., I would suggest listening to Red Star of Asia. in general, I mean, there is Jacobin has gotten better about its international coverage, but it's also kind of weak, if I'm honest. So, and pretty much limited to Latin America and Europe. So it's, I think it's a good thing to go over. You guys have gone over some historical stuff that I really don't think people realize how thorough the leftist suppression was in South Korea, and how violent it was, even, into living memory. I mean, I think I was born a few months after the Gwangju massacre happened. So there are plenty of people that remember this in South Korea and remember these things actually happening. And so this is not even the past of the Korean War. This is only 40 years ago. And in some cases only 20 years ago, and in some cases only 6 years ago.
Yeah, so. Korean War is still in living memory for some as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. So Korean War ended in the 50s. Yeah, it's still going to be in living memory for a while. So, although, as a side note, it's strange how it is remembered, because as a Waikugang who went to the demilitarized zone, it's kind of a theme park that's also a war zone, which is very strange. That's a whole different topic, but it is something, they always tell you to do it when you're up there, and then you're like, well, why would I go visit a technical war zone? And
great family vacation.
But it is kind of treated as both an act, a place of potential active conflict and a tourist destination. It is very weird. So anyway, it's just a weird side note about how it's memorialized in a conflict that's technically still live. Actually, I mean, it's at ceasefire, but it's never actually been ended. The war is still technically going on. So it's something to know. Thank you guys for coming on. I really enjoyed it. I hope my audience learned a lot. We, like I said, I don't think there's a lot of this out in English right now. It goes into this kind of detail, so I really thank you for that. And I hope you guys have a great day. I got to do some silly podcasting business, so I'm going to do that right now. And
yeah, I've got to go to work.
Yeah. Have a great day, guys.
All right.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Varn. Really appreciate
it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And so I just have to thank a patron who subscribed up to the Kahane Khan level. And that is Cole. Thank you, Cole, for helping us bring things like this for everybody. You will find a link to their podcast in my notes. And I really do check it out. It'll give you a perspective on left things in English that you're not going to get in most left media in the United States. So take care and have a good day.